So welcome to everybody here as well as watching the video to our ongoing study. I see some people look at the camera and say, I didn't know I was on camera. Ongoing study of the Old Testament. Before we jump in too far, and Joe has to slow me down a little bit, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Most wonderful and gracious Heavenly Father, God, especially in this time right now, this season we find ourselves in, it can be so busy and so full of activities, and sometimes it can even feel so empty. Lord, what a blessing it is to be able to come here, to be in your house, to meditate on your word. I'm so thankful for each and every one of these saints that have gathered here today. And God, I just pray that as we explore your word, as you reveal yourself to us in your story, Lord, that these fellow journeyers with me will help to enlighten your story. Lord, that they will reveal their input, Lord, their unique experiences with your word, so that it would enliven my journey a little bit. And God, we just give you all the honor, all the praise, and all the glory. We thank you for tonight. Be with us and guide us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, folks. When we left off last week, we had, even before last week, we saw the northern kingdom of Israel had finally reaped the rewards of all their evil doings, and how each and every one of their kings seemed to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. They were carried off into exile, never to be heard from again by the Assyrians. Then we kind of focused in with a laser focus on the southern kingdom of Judah. And for a while, as we went through the southern kings, the kings of Judah, we had a long line of them that did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. That's why they lasted about 150 years more than the northern kingdom did before they go into exile. But eventually we have a run of their last kings that did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so when we finished up last week, we finished up with a guy named Jehoiakim. He was 25 years old when he became king. He reigned for about 11 years. And he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his predecessors. And that's how we ended chapter 23 of 2 Kings. And we start with chapter 24 tonight. So, while he is king of Judah, during his 11-year reign, King Nebuchadnezzar, which was at that time the king of Babylon, invades the land. Now, as we will see when we get into the prophetic writings in the months to come, this does or should not come as a surprise to the kingdom of Judah, to the southern kingdom, because the prophets all along have been saying, come on guys, get your act together. If you don't, here's what God says. You're going to have an enemy come from the north and he's going to turn you over to them. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar invades the land. Now, Jehoiakim kind of staves off the inevitable by agreeing to become his servant or vassal for about 3 years. So in exchange for not being killed or carried off into exile then, he says, look, just leave us be. We're more valuable to you where we are than if you just defeat us and carry us off as you have done everybody else. He said, just let us keep working the land and everything. We'll send you a little bit of something every now and then. Everybody wins here, right? Nebuchadnezzar says, you know what? I like the cut of your jib. We'll try that for a while. So after about 3 years, Jehoiakim changes his mind and he rebels against King Nebuchadnezzar. So that is when God finalizes his plan to use these raiders from the north, raiders from Babylon, Aram, Moab, and Ammon. And he sends all these groups of people in to destroy Judah. And like I said, this shouldn't be a surprise. This is actually in accordance with what God has already spoke to the people through the prophets. So they go in and, let's see. Trying to decipher my notes here. Jehoiakim ends up dying, and his son Jehoiachin succeeds him. Now, Jehoiachin only reigned 3 months. And in those short 3 months, he managed to do exactly what his dad did and many others before him. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So because he is continuing on with the evil, because he hadn't changed anything, God continues to allow the Babylonians and these other foreign interlopers, raiders, come in and destroy the kingdom of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar himself decides to come to town, and the king surrenders to him. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he ransacks Jerusalem, takes everything of value, all of its riches, takes it out, and he also at this time takes all the people of Jerusalem, everybody but the poorest of the poor, the people that would have had no value to the kingdom of Babylon. He leaves them there, leaves them behind. But everybody else he takes into exile and deports them to Babylon. Meanwhile, he takes Jehoiachin back and into exile as well. But what he does was he makes Jehoiachin's uncle, Mattaniah, the king. So what he does is he sets up a puppet government. Much like the Romans did. I think we talked about this last week, where when the Romans came in, they would appoint leaders like Herod, King Herod, from the Bible story we just read for Jesus' birth. King Herod was a Jew, but he was a political appointee of Rome. And the Babylonians did the same thing. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to take everything of value, I'm going to take all your people. By the way, Dickie, you're now the king. You're the king. Watch over things, do things the way I want you to do them. Oh, by the way, your name's not Dickie anymore. I'm going to change your name to Zedekiah. And so Zedekiah ends up as the last king of the southern kingdom. So Jehoiachin, 3 months until Nebuchadnezzar sacks Jerusalem, deports him, makes his uncle Zedekiah king. Zedekiah is 21 years old when he becomes king. He reigns in Jerusalem for 11 years as an underling of Babylon. He does evil in the eyes of the Lord, just like Jehoiakim had done. And it was because of the Lord's anger that everything happened to Jerusalem and Judah. And so now Zedekiah, who is a political appointee and has kind of been doing this job for 11 years, he says, you know what? I think I'm done. I don't think I'm going to do things the way that Nebuchadnezzar wants them anymore. And so he ends up rebelling against Babylon. And so in the 9th year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar says, man, I guess I can't just leave these Israelites in charge of their own place. So he comes a-calling, and he lays siege to the city. Now Zedekiah does a pretty good job of holding them at bay for about 2 years. So this started 9 years into his reign, and he holds out until his 11th year. He sees the handwriting on the wall. He's like, man, we're just not going to be able to hold out much longer. So in the middle of the night one night, they decide to make a run for it. But it doesn't go too well. So the Babylonian army hears that that the king and some of his officials have snuck out through a hole in the wall and took off. And he chases them down. They chase them down. They get captured. Zedekiah is separated from his soldiers. And they are brought before the leader, the Babylonian leader, and Zedekiah has to watch as his sons are killed before him. So they murder his sons right before him, lets him see that, and as soon as he witnesses that, they gouge his eyes out, and then he is taken away to Babylon in exile. The army goes back, lays waste to Jerusalem, completely destroys Jerusalem, and burns the temple to the ground. Now, if you remember anything about the temple, it was primarily made out of stone, right? So you can't really burn stone. But all the furnishings, all the woodwork in it, it was completely burned. The temple was destroyed. So this is the second temple that Jerusalem has built here that has been destroyed. So all the remaining residents, except for just a few poor workers, are exiled to Babylon. They take the chief priest, the second priest in command, all the doorkeepers, the officer in charge of the soldiers, the secretary, and 60 of the secretary's men, They're taken all to King Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar has them all executed on the spot. So this is a day in Jerusalem that it does not pay to be in any kind of position of power, because it's going to be off with your head at the order of King Nebuchadnezzar. So they're all executed. Nebuchadnezzar appoints another leader named Gedaliah, and then he heads back home. He says, all right, I'm tired of hanging out in this backwater town of Jerusalem. I need to get back to Babylon where my home is. Meanwhile, turn the page too quick. Meanwhile, a guy named Ishmael, lost my place here. Ishmael rises up and kills Gedaliah, as well as all those with him. So Gedaliah was a sympathizer. That's what we would have called him in the war between the states, right? You know, the southern folks that aligned with the cause of the north, them old no good sympathizers. Mm-hmm. Well, Ishmael rises up, kills Gedaliah and his men, and then instead of sticking around to finish the job, they take off and turn tail and run like a bunch of cowards and go hide out in Egypt. Because I think they know that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be calling for their head if they stick around. So, meanwhile, for 37 years, Jehoiachin remains in exile in Babylon. King Jehoiachin, the second to the last king of Judah. Afterwards, after 37 years, Nebuchadnezzar has a little soft spot in his heart for old Jehoiachin, and he releases him. He lets him out of prison, and he ends up giving him an allowance for the rest of his life. He has to stay in Babylon, but he gets an allowance from the king. He also gets a seat of honor. So he goes from being a political prisoner, a prisoner of war, to being somebody that's got a little bit of standing, a little bit of honor in Babylon. And so, thus ends Israel and Judah's chapter. For now, anyway. Israel is to never be heard from again. So the 10 northern tribes, even to this day, they have not been reconstituted, not been brought back. They're called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Judah will return from exile after 70, 80 years or so of punishment under Babylon, and then later Persian rule, because Persia will come in and overthrow the kingdom of Babylon. So they will struggle in exile under those two regimes until God says, you know what, I think they might have learned their lesson. We're going to let them go on back home. Now they will return back to their homeland, but things are going to be way different when we see them on the other side. All right, folks. That is it for 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, what we're going to do for 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as I make my way into 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I got to tell you that if you've never noticed that there's certain parts of the Bible that seem repetitious, right? And we're at a part of the Bible that is repetitious. So we've been through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, which has told us a great story of how 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, really, by the name Kings, tells us that we're focusing in on how Israel came to have a king, right? And we remember the story about how God was the king of the Israelites, but they looked around at everybody, all these foreigners around, like, wait a second, they all have kings, we don't have a king, we want a king, we want a king. Remember, they told Samuel that, and Samuel's like, I don't think you really want what you think you want. God's like, don't worry about it. They're not rebelling against you. They're rebelling against me. Give them what they asked for. That's how we got Saul, and eventually King David, then King Solomon. So the books of Samuel and the books of Kings really have pointed us, give us the story of how Israel got a king and what that looked like all the way from the time the first king, Saul, was appointed until the last king, Zedekiah, goes down in flames and the southern kingdom goes into exile. So what First and Second Chronicles does is it retells a lot of that same story, the same history, just from a different point of view. Kind of like when we get to the New Testament. You know, we've got 4 Gospels, right? Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, if you've ever sat down and read those Gospels in, maybe not all in one sitting, but read them pretty close together, like over the course of a month or so, you would notice a lot of similarities. Like, man, by the time I get to Luke, I think I've heard that story before. Maybe a couple of times before. Well, the Gospels are just 4 different people's points of view on the same story. The life and times of Jesus the Christ. Well, this is the Old Testament version of that. The authors that wrote the books of Samuel and the books of King, they were focused in on Israel's history as it pertained to the kingly line, or the royal line. Political leaders, as it were. Now, the chronicler, that's what they call the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they tell the same story of the history of Israel, but their main purpose is for us, dear hearers of the word, to understand the spiritual and the priestly implications of Israel's story during this time. And so instead of going through these stories, we're actually going to move through 1st and 2nd Chronicles rather quickly. In fact, we might get through them all tonight. So instead of going back and retelling you the same story that we've already heard over the last few weeks, I'm just going to kind of highlight the major points of Chronicles and then kind of give you a side-by-side of, okay, here's the story or the storyline and how Samuel and Kings approached it, and here's how Chronicles approaches it. That way you see the pros and the cons, or the similarities and the differences that way. Would that be okay? Does that sound like a good way? I mean, I can go back and tell the stories all over again, but we've already heard them. I'll just tell you mainly what the difference is. Well, dear friends, if you take nothing out of the Old Testament, take this. There are a lot of genealogies in the Old Testament. And if you're anything like me, pretty soon these genealogies start to sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. Like, wah, 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 wah. Like, really, why do I need to know who begat who and who begat who? Now, I will tell you, in an entirely different class that's not quite so basic in an overview like this, I could explain to you why the genealogies are so important and how I've learned to appreciate them and what I get out of them, but it's not really the purview of this class. So I'm going to move rather quickly through these genealogies, but 1st Chronicles starts off with about 9 chapters of genealogy. The first 9 chapters is dedicated to genealogy, and I'm going to tell you why they do that. For history writers, during the period of time that the Old Testament was written, these things weren't written down. This was oral tradition. It was passed by word of mouth. And one of the ways that they were able to retain their history is through these genealogies, to tell the story of who your people were, where you came from. My son, Cooper, he is descended from a line of people that came here, believe it or not, on the Mayflower. All right? Huh?
Brewster, right?
Yep, from William Brewster, who was, he was a traveler on the Mayflower. To me, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, it doesn't matter how you got here, it just matters that we're here. But for his family, that's a point of great pride that he can trace his lineage at least as far back as the Mayflower. And in the safe, I've got a little thing that his grandmother got from the Mayflower Society certifying that he has got relatives that go back through William Brewster. And I was like, cool. Well, it's the same thing for these folks here. You know, it is a point of national pride to know, you know, which line you descended from. And so the chronicler, they give these historical records, and they start at Adam. Because it all starts with Adam, right? I mean, we all trace our lineage back to good old Adam, for better or for worse. And if you remember what I told you all about the Old Testament, it starts off in Genesis with a wide view. So we've got all of creation. God created everything. And then in Genesis 3, or Genesis 2, God's like, all right, let's narrow the story from all of creation to just this capstone, this crowning achievement called humankind. And we're going to tell my story of creation through the story of humankind. Then from humankind, we start to narrow it down. Well, first off, we start with Adam, we start with Eve, and it goes out from there. Eventually, by the time we get to, chapter 9, 9 is after the flood, Tower of Babel. The nations are scattered. You remember that story from the Tower of Babel. And God's like, all right, now I want to start redeeming creation, and I'm going to do it through one people. And so we eventually narrow it down to Abraham. And he says, from Abraham, I'm going to work through his son, Isaac. Through Isaac, we're narrowing it even further down. Isaac, then it will be one of, through his son, Jacob, who Jacob has 12 sons, which becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, out of those 12 tribes of Israel, we're going to, those are my people. God said, those are my people. I'm going to set those people aside. But out of those 12 tribes, one tribe, the tribe of Judah, that's going to be a special tribe, because from him will become King David, right? The root of Jesse. From David, now we're going to work down through, and eventually we'll get to where we just celebrated the birth of a very special child, Jesus the Christ, that comes from the line of David. And then God takes the story and breaks it wide open. So the Old Testament is all about condensing, telling the story, bringing it in tighter and tighter, and then from Jesus, it goes back outwards. From Jesus back to the Jews, from Jews to all the peoples, and then eventually, we get to Revelation, where his plan is complete. We get the Jesus scared out of us. He wraps everything up, new heaven and a new earth. All right. Broad strokes of the Bible right there. I know it's crazy. Well, Chronicles do the same thing. Starts with Adam, runs that genealogy down through Abraham, and then from the family of Abraham, he kind of goes in a couple of different directions. It tells you about Esau's kids. Well, we know Esau, that's the twin brother of Jacob who becomes Israel, right? Esau goes this direction. God takes the story through Jacob this way. But, he says, okay, well, let me tell you a little bit about Esau's people, right? And we find some very familiar names there in the line of Esau. Let's see if I can find a couple of them here. Of course, I had one. I was studying it earlier. No, I'm looking for specific tribes. All right, we'll get back to that. And then he says, all right, well, let me tell you about Israel's sons. And he said, here's the sons of Israel. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar. He goes through the list, and there's 12 of them here. Well, they correlate to those 12 regions that I showed you on the map last week, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 different tribes that made up the people called Israel. Out of those 12, he says, now, those were 12. Now let me tell you about Judah here in chapter 2. And then he goes and tells you a little bit about Judah's people. He's like, oh yeah, there's this guy named Perez, and he had some sons, but let me tell you about these guys. Let me run over here and tell you about this guy. And eventually he kind of wanders, and he kind of keeps bringing it in. He's like, oh yeah. Man, that reminds me of a really good guy. David. Yeah, King David. And then he tells us the story of the sons of David through this. He says, oh yeah, Judah has some other clans. Let me tell you about some other clans of Judah. Tells you about the royal line after the exile. And just kind of goes through it. And by the time he gets to chapter 9, he has told you all about the 12 tribes of Israel. Giving you the genealogy of Saul in chapter 8. And then by 9, he's ready to tell the story. And he gives you the genealogy of Saul again. So chapter 9, boom, gets us to this point. So the books of Samuel and Kings, their main audience was the people who had already been carried off to exile. So by the time this story is written, Israel and Judah have fallen to the sword. They've been carried off in exile. They need a word of history and hope. That's what the books of Samuel and Kings were about. The books of Chronicles were actually written to the people after the exile to remind them of who they were and whose they were and how they got where they were at. And the concern was not so much on the kingly line who had let them down, because remember, kings are human beings, right? We don't put a lot of faith and hope into human beings because they will fail and let us down. The chronicler says, now let's talk about, I'm going to give you the history up until here. But now let's talk about David. Man, David was a really good guy. Solomon was a really good guy. And then things went to, kind of went south after that. Now we need to talk about the priests. So when we put the books of Samuel and Kings alongside the books of the Chronicles, Samuel and Kings talks about two kingdoms. It's called the divided kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. Chronicles says, all right, that's our history. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it up front. Boom, we're not going to worry about it. We're going to focus in on the southern kingdom. The Samuel and Kings, they want to tell us about the political history. Chronicles says, political history is good, but man, that just messed us up. Let's talk about our religious history. Samuel and Kings, they were written by prophets. Chronicles was written by a priestly author. The perspective that we have for Samuel and Kings is one of prophets. I mean, prophets are constantly speaking. Samuel being the biggest prophet speaking. When we get to Chronicles, we have Levitical perspective. The perspective of somebody that works in the temple is telling us this story. Samuel and Kings was written very soon after the events that led to the exile. Chronicles is written way long after the exile. If you can say one thing about Samuel and Kings, you can say it was pretty dang negative. There was a whole bunch of, man, Saul did this wrong, and man, Saul did that wrong, and he was ripped away. Oh, David, and you know what David did with Bathsheba, right? And what he did to her husband Uriah. Oh yeah, and Solomon, who was supposed to be this awesome guy and so wise, and all of a sudden now he's doing things that he's not supposed to, and these foreign wives and stuff. So it's very negative. All the did evil in the eyes of the Lord things. Well, Chronicles is written with a much more positive perspective because they've come back from the exile. They need that word of hope. And I'm just going to take a little side rabbit trail. My wife gave me a book early on. You gave it to me in March of 2014. I became a pastor in June of 2014. So with an eye towards me becoming a pastor, she gave me a book. And it was written by a guy he was the associate pastor to a guy named Orville Butcher, Reverend Orville Butcher. Orville Butcher started off his life in ministry with Billy Graham in the Crusades for Christ. I mean, he was like Billy Graham's right-hand man. And after a number of years doing that job, he felt the calling to pastoral ministry, moved to San Diego, had a vision to build a church called Skyline Church in San Diego. It was a lot like Ebenezer out in the middle of nowhere when he had that vision, but as San Diego grew up around it, it turned into this big, just a mega church. Well, to say all this to say this, Derek Johnson, which was the guy that wrote the book, he was so excited when he had the opportunity to go and to work under Orville Butcher because he remembered the Orville Butcher that stood alongside Billy Graham and that taught in seminary when Derek was in seminary. He said, man, I just remember how powerful that man was and how theologically dense his speaking was. He said, so the first couple of weeks that I get to hear him preach in this new church, and he said, I'm sitting there with my note cards and my pen. He said, I'm just ready to write it down. He says, and then I get to the end of the sermon, I realize I don't have anything to write down. He said, a few weeks went by, and finally I went to Reverend Butcher and I said, what's the deal? He said, I had an entirely different perspective to give you when I was teaching and when I was, the Crusades for Christ. He said, here, my people need a word of hope. He said, they need to know that Jesus loves them and Jesus died for their sins and everything's going to be okay. He says, I can bring in evangelists, I can bring in prophets to speak a hard word to them, but for me, my people need a word of hope. The Israelites, man, they've been 80 years in exile. They think that God has abandoned them. They come back to a land that has been looted and pillaged and destroyed. And we'll see that in the next couple of weeks when we get into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. These people needed to hear a word of hope. So the chronicler is very positive with how they write the book and tell the story. Samuel and Kings, they talk about that rebellion against the covenant and the judgment that God brings on them. The chronicler is all about that hope for the future, about God's faithfulness versus man's failings. So, same story, two radically different ways of approaching it, which I think we need both of them. I mean, we really do. We need both sides of the coin here. And so that's how they approach it. So in chapter 10, beginning in chapter 10 to 29, the chronicler kind of tells us a story about how David rises up through the ranks. So it starts with Saul. We have the genealogy of Saul, and in chapter 10 it's like, oh yeah, by the way, Saul got wounded in battle, and he took his own life. And that's how David became king. So Saul, his 3 sons died, all his house died together, now David's king, all right? David comes in, conquers Jerusalem. So the story that we got in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings that was long and drawn out of all these battles, running battles that Saul and David fought, the chronicler just glossed over. It's like, you know what? Saul's gone, David's king. Man, he's doing a great job. And then gives more and more genealogy work here. Talks about bringing back the ark from when it was in exile. You remember that story where they took 6 steps, stopped, had a mass slaughter of animals, offering it, and he's dancing in the street acting all foolish. His wife's up there looking down from the window going, I can't believe he's doing that. Much like my wife was doing on Friday night when I come out with my bare feet and I saw some looks out there going, I can't believe our pastor is out here barefooted looking like he just come from Palestine or something. But David is so in love with the Lord that he's just dancing with the bandit out there. Would have just made a good Baptist blush over how he was dancing. Eventually,
I did notice that you were the only one in costume.
Yeah.
we had 2 others laid out for Mary and Joseph that were in the back, but they decided that since all they were doing was just talking for that little short skit and go back to seat, they didn't want to wear a costume. So.
I think they suckered you in on that one.
Well, it was my idea. I thought it'd be a great idea. But I don't know what y'all think. Did it add a little something to the service?
I thought it looked great.
Yeah, and you know what? My loving wife, they say a prophet is never without honor. I told you this morning, except in their own hometown. I thought we had a beautiful service. Finished it up, and you know what the first words my wife said to me? I was going to tell you your dress was on backwards. Now, you look great, husband. You did a great job. No, your dress was on backwards. So she probably didn't get anything out of the service except looking, saying, I can't believe you put that thing on backwards.
I think that'd be fun.
That's why Paul says, if you can stay single, stay single.
Your legs are wider than mine.
Oh, tell me about it. I haven't worn pants shorts in like 3 years.
Oh gosh, I haven't had any on 20 years.
I'm gonna have to give you a good tanning lamp out. So anyway, so chapters, 1 Chronicles chapters 10 through 12 outline David's ascension to the throne. We already know that story. Chapters 13 through 16 outline how he brought the ark back to Jerusalem, how he ministered before the ark. Once again, this is a different point of view because we were given, in the other books, we were given a point of view about the king bringing something back into Jerusalem that should have been there all along, blah, 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 what a great king, oh, our king's awesome. This is portraying David almost like a priest. He's ministering like a priest before the Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 17 through 20 outline the covenant that God makes with David, which is really just briefly given to us in the other books. Basically saying, hey, if you do what I tell you to do and you stay a man after my own heart, well, I promise that you will always have a descendant on the throne. Well, yeah, that lasted until good old Zedekiah. And then that was that. Now, that's what we think. But then God was also looking way forward to what nobody then except the prophets could understand, is that through the line of David would eventually come Jesus. Now, a lot of people would argue, well, Jesus is not on the throne anymore. Oh, he's not. What throne are you thinking of? Because Jesus absolutely still is on the throne. So even to this day, there is a descendant of David's on the throne and will be for all of eternity. So that's basically the Davidic covenant. And then remember, David wants to build a temple for the Lord. Remember, way back in the other 4 books that we talked about, and remember what David said, or what God said to David? He was like, nah, he says, I know you want to do something good for me. He said, but have I not been content with being in this tent for this long? No, David, you're not the guy for the job. Tell you what, you got a lot of blood on your hands. You're a warrior. I need somebody with clean hands to do that job. I think your son Solomon will be the perfect one for the job. And so David then sets up his son for success by saying, you know what? I'm not going to be king forever, and when I'm gone and it's your turn, Solomon, I want you to have everything you need to start this job right. And so he starts stockpiling materials, nails and wood and stuff like that, to get Solomon in a good place. And then Solomon picks up with that, makes treaties with people like the king of Tyre, the king of Sidon, where he gets cedars from Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And so that's how we finish out 1 Chronicles, is by seeing David make those temple preparations. So 1 Chronicles is all about telling the early story of Israel's history through the genealogies, and bringing us up to speed to where David becomes king, David does what he does as king, and then that's it. 2 Chronicles is really the story about Solomon. A good bit of it is dedicated to Solomon, and then the last part of it is, oh yeah, and after Solomon there were some bad kings in the southern kingdom. There were some good kings and there were some bad kings. Things went off the rails, and y'all know the rest because you've been in exile for 80 years. So there you go. So we start off in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. We talk about Solomon's wisdom. We read that story before, where he's a young man and he goes to God and says, God, how am I supposed to lead these people when I'm just a youngster, right? God, you got to help me out. God's like, well, tell me what you want, Solomon. Now, God, knowing man's heart, is almost half expecting, well, a little bit of money would be nice because people respect you if you got money. How about power? People respect power. Now, Solomon says, I tell you what, I'm unwise. I need some wisdom to lead the people. God's like, you're kidding me. Out of everything you could ask me for and you ask for wisdom, yeah, I'll give you wisdom. You'll be the wisest man there's ever been, and I'm going to give you money and power and prestige. And so that's the story that we get in chapter 1 of 2 Chronicles. Chapter 2 is retelling, chapters 2 through 7 is retelling how Solomon built the temple in great detail. Once again, like I said, I'm just going to kind of gloss over this story because it's the story that we've all heard. Chapters 8 and 9 kind of tell us just how awesome Solomon's reign was, how prosperous he was, and he actually, his father was able to unite all of Israel into one united kingdom. Solomon kept it together, although God would break it apart after Solomon's reign because Solomon allowed himself to be led astray by foreign wives, not necessarily foreign wives, but the foreign gods of those wives. But during Solomon's reign, he took what his father had entrusted to him, which was a united kingdom, and grew that kingdom, almost exponentially. Israel's lands grew enormously under his prosperous reign. And once again, Samuel and Kings focus on Saul's negativity, or the negativity, not of Saul, of Solomon. The things that he did wrong, the things that caused the kingdom to be ripped from him after his death. Whereas the chronicler says, man, this guy he did good stuff. He really did a lot of good work. Almost seems to me like U.S. history from time to time. I know that most of you are old enough to remember the reign of Jimmy the Peanut Carter as president. Now, my father, who was a Democrat, and Jimmy Carter was a Democrat, my dad had nothing good to say about that guy. Man, worst president ever. Terrible guy. Sorry, no good, inflation, And I've read the history books. I know he probably made some questionable decisions, and prices went through the roof, and your car, gas lines went around him. But now you think about people, think back, and they're like, well, Jim, yeah, I think he was a pretty good guy. Especially after you read a story of him being 90-some years old, still teaching Sunday school, right? You're like, yeah, Jimmy Carter, he was probably pretty good. So, a little bit of age kind of colors how we remember things. And so since these accounts of Solomon were written well after the first accounts that we've already written, could be that people are a little gentler now looking back, kind of smoothing over Solomon's rough edges and say, yeah, you know what? He probably had a few problems, but I think we did pretty good under him. Let's see. The last part of this, which is the last 26 chapters, recounts the story of after he dies, how the kingdom gets ripped from him, gets divided up into the north and the south kingdom. That's chapters 10 through 13. And then chapters 14 through 36 is a recounting of all the kings of Judah. They don't even bother tell us. You remember how the other books went back and forth. So we'd have a few kings from Israel, a few kings from Judah. A few kings from Israel, a few kings from Judah. Oh, Israel finally messed up enough that God wiped them out. No more kings from Israel. Samaria's gone. And now, all Chronicles is focused on is just the kings of Judah. So we have, I don't know, about 18 chapters there, 19 chapters telling us about the kings of Judah, what each one did, and basically just a retelling the story. And honestly, once again, they're kind of glossing over some of the rough spots and accentuating the positive. However, they do point out when some of these kings went off the rails and what happened. But they really do focus on the positive. They don't talk so much about the wars, a lot fewer wars in here. And really hammer on those genealogies to where the folks know the history and the lineage, where as the other 4 books, they're like, look, we're just going to tell you a story. You don't need to know about the family lines. There'll be a guy come later on that is going to write a book called Chronicles, and he'll tell you all about that, but I'm not going to bore you. I'm just going to tell you a good story. And so, folks, that's really it in a nutshell. I mean, we could have spent a couple of weeks on this and went back and retold the stories. Stories are much the same, just a little different point of view is all it is. So, man, you guys have moved through 2 books of the Bible tonight. And we got it done before Elena had to leave. So next week we will pick up with the books of, we're going to start with Ezra. I don't know that we'll get through Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah are 2 prophetic books that are written during the time of exile, when Judah is in exile in Babylon, but certain people are allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Ezra being one of them, and not too long after Ezra, Nehemiah is allowed by the Persians to go back, and we'll talk about what that looks like, about how these 2 men are preparing the promised land for the re-entry of the Israelites, and what that's going to look like. It's going to be a radically different landscape. So we'll start with that next week. So I bid you to go in peace. God bless you, and thanks for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.